Between 2006 and now, Anushiya Ramaswamy has been translating the fiction of Tamil writer Shobasakthi. It started with Shobasakthi's debut, Gorilla, written in 2001, which Anushiya translated and was published by Random House India in 2008. This was followed by the novel Traitor in 2010 and the short story collection The MGR Murder Trial in 2014. His more recent work includes Box and Itcha, which are on standby for English publication. Shobasakthi was born Anthonydasan Jasudasan in Allepiti in Jaffna. Growing up in the 1980s, his life was shaped and shattered by the violence and uncertainty brought on by the Sri Lankan civil conflict. The autofiction genre, which Shobasakthi works in, forcefully captures his own ruptured journey from Jaffna to Colombo and to France through Hong Kong and Thailand. In addition to his cult status as a contemporary Tamil writer, Shobasakthi is also a filmmaker and an actor, which includes roles in Jack Odiad's Deepan and Matthew Heineman's A Private War. Anushiya Ramaswamy is faculty at the University of South Illinois Edwardsville, where she is a professor in the Department of English.
So today I am with Anushiya Ramaswamy. Anushiya, who is, I think, most widely known in Sri Lanka as the translator of Shobasakthi, joining us from Illinois in the United States. Anushiya is a faculty member of the Department of English at the Southern Illinois University Edwardsville, specializing in Dalit writing, and who teaches in several courses including composition and rhetoric, and in writing. And where Shobasakthi is concerned, Anushiya is the translator of Shobasakti's Gorilla, his earliest work, which was translated by, which was published in translation by Random House India in 2008. Traitor, published by Penguin India in 2010, and the MGR Murder Trial in 2015. So this is a very short conversation amidst a busy schedule with Anushiya. Thank you, Anushiya, for joining us.
Thank you, Vihanga, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk about one's own work and to talk about what is closest to one's heart. And as a translator, the translator is never remembered. The translator, right? I mean, the translator is always invisible. So the translator, to speak to the translator is rare. So I'm pleased. Thank you.
Yeah. So Anushiya, the discussion today, we will be talking about Shobasakthi, what it means to be translating Shobasakthi, and if the conversation allows us, what it means to teach Shobasakthi. So as a way of kind of getting into things, I would like you to ask how you, as a scholar, as a translator, as a reader, how you locate what we might call the Shobasakthi experience, because he is an experience, reading Shobasakthi is an experience. How you place that Shobasakthi experience in the global Sri Lankan or the global Tamil writing discourse? We can start there.
Okay, so when I first encountered his work, it was a short story in a small publication. You know, Indian publications, they come and they go. And this was a magazine, I think, that stayed alive for like less than a year. And I read his short story, and I was, the Shobasakthi experience happened, which was, I was amazed at his syntax, his sophistication, his ability to move between so many kind of worlds, I would say. He, you know, not just the kind of, not just geographical worlds, but also kind of the exiles world, the refugees world, the poor person's world, the marginal world, as well as a home that he is able to effortlessly call upon. So I contacted him and he mailed me, sent by mail, his Tamil novel Gorilla. And I had never read anything like it before, because the only kinds of, remember Shyam Selvadurai's Funny Boy? People have written in English about my generation's coming of age in Colombo. Shyam Selvadurai's, even I think Cinnamon Gardens had also come out by then. So very familiar, and yet Shoba's writings were so intimate in a way that I had not found elsewhere. He evoked a world that was not mine personally. This is very interesting. It was not mine personally, in that I do not share his class. I don't share his home island. He's not even Northern Jaffna, but then he belongs to the islands, who are even more marginal than mainland Jaffna. So he's very aware of that he's from the islands. So I grew up in Colombo. I'm of Indian origin. So I don't share many of the kind of subject positions that his characters embody. And yet he spoke to me in a way that I found surprising to me. It made me wonder, how is it that as a reader, I am able to enter? So it was a revelatory experience in the most profound way. And of course, the larger history that we all share, which was, of course, the reason why you are interested in it too. And you teach Gorilla and, the terrorist the traitor, I'm sorry, not the terrorist, the traitor in your classrooms. It calls upon us in different ways. And I thought that was only an extraordinary literature can do that. And he's so sure. His confidence in his world views. It's not a single world view, but in his confidence in his world view that I see. I'm amazed at that each time a new short story of his comes out, or his novels come out. He's also, he's extraordinary in producing in multiple genres. So he writes essays. He's very much a central part of, Tamil literary writings, Tamil political writings in the diaspora in India. He's, in Tamil Nadu, he visits Tamil Nadu at least twice a year. His work is published in Tamil Nadu. He's, like I said, he's very much a part of, an integral part of that conversation. And he kind of conducts that conversation with Elan, I should say. And that is extremely kind of seductive to anyone who works with literature and who teaches writing also. So for me, Shobasakthi, reading being introduced to Shobasakthi's writing was in a lot of ways an opening that I have never gone back. Let me also add that in 1988, the first time I read about, now this is the representation of a Sri Lankan refugee, was in Bharati Mukherjee, the Indian-born, creative writer who lives in, I think she lives in California, but then she was in Canada. And she wrote in one of the stories in her Middleman and Other Stories. One of the stories was of a Sri Lankan who, by hook or by crook, moves to the West, the way many Sri Lankans were moving, Sri Lankan Tamils were moving during that time, using agents, lying their way as political refugees all across, Europe. And this story was so, on the one hand, somebody had clearly told her things. She'd had an informant who told her how Sri Lankan Tamils, now in 1988, this was really a bad time for Sri Lankan Tamils because the IPKF was coming in. A war like nothing we had seen was being waged in the north. And so people who could leave were leaving. And the character that Bharati Mukherjee talks about is a middle-class Tamil person who is also an Anglophile, very much like me, somebody who had read all the books that I had read. So I should have found myself kind of seduced by her. Instead, I found myself repelled by that story. I was deeply offended. Who told her about how these helpless young people were leaving? Instead of choosing a younger person, she chose a middle-aged man, a very unlikable person who is an outlier rather than the majority, the normal group that was leaving by boats, that was stuck in a refugee camp somewhere or the other, was desperate. That desperation was not there in her story, but it had all the details correctly done. So clearly somebody talked to her, somebody in Canada had talked to her. So that kind of a repelling stayed with me throughout the 1990s until I read Shobasakthi and I realized, oh, there's a whole world of Tamil writers who are actually writing. He was one amongst many others, but he's the only one, who I have translated. But there are others who are writing. It's a kind of a continuum or different at different levels. There are some of them who are very good, some of them who are not very good. A lot of poetry, lots of poetry. So that world in Tamil is very rich. And of course, as Kadri Ismail, talks about so beautifully, it's the imperialists' language that actually opens up the world for writers who are otherwise in every way marginal, right? So only when you get translated do you find an audience. Until then, you are simply talking to a room full of people. So for me, my translation of Shobasakthi actually comes out of a personal joy in reading him and wanting to share, and also a kind of a sad realization that unless this enters an imperial language, which English is, the colonizer's language, he is not going to be read. And I think that is a loss for the world.
Yeah, so I think from here, I would say the logical point I should drive the conversation towards is what it means to actually, map Sri Lanka or the Sri Lankan experience through a writer like Shobasakthi. But before going there, I mean, if I may drop a couple of pennies of my own,
yes,
I would say like when I first came across Shobasakthi, this was probably 2006, 2007, thereabouts. And my first Shobasakthi text that I read was Gorilla. This was a little bit later. And some of the points you share actually resonates with me as well. The kind of novelty, the freshness of not only the experience, but also the voice with which this guy was addressing the audience. And I think in some way, Shobasakthi kind of became like a cult text among the English department crowd. So I remember some of us discussing Shobasakthi, and we didn't even have proper texts. He's, as you say, quite famous and widespread in Tamil Nadu, but in Sri Lanka, I have my own anecdote trying to locate Shobasakthi texts. I remember once going through all bookshops that were around, and suddenly somewhere it came as a bright idea that maybe one place that I should look at was at Pubalasingham bookshop in Colombo. Pubalasingham Jaffna had the Colombo branch in this fairly ditchy neighborhood somewhere in Fort. And I remember this is somewhere probably 2011, 2012.
Right. After the
So
war.
after the war, I think I was looking for Traitor actually. So, and I went and I remember this girl who was at the counter, and I told him, I don't even remember whether I spoke in English or Sinhala, but I said, I'm looking for a translation of Shobasakthi. And I remember how her eyes shot out when I said this. And she actually disappeared into the shop and came out with who I think is the manager. And then the manager said, we don't have Shobasakthi. Probably she thought I'm
Shobasakthi. We will never have Shobasakthi. He wanted to make clear to you.
clear.
Right,
Or later on, in retrospect, I was wondering whether they even thought I was an undercover cop or something.
Right.
Coming there.
I would think so. I would think
Okay.
so. Of course. Of course. They were frightened. They were truly frightened.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I mean, like, when I started reading Traitor, that kind of unfolded a totally different world,
Right.
where representing conflict, representing that kind of trauma. Actually, this character in Traitor, Pakiri, I think that's his name.
Pakiri. Yes.
That's one of my, I would say, most memorable characters of literature all time. So very enigmatic character. Yeah.
Right. I mean, Shobasakthi is actually extraordinarily good in picking out a figure like Pakiri and giving them, tics that you will recognize, carrying a dish, his food dish all the time, eating so slowly. Remember, he describes Pakiri as eating his food all day. And at the same time, I mean, he has short stories with these kinds of characters too. They have a voice. They are very Dickensian in that. He's very Dickensian in that. He's also like a 19th century Russian writer. There's an ethic to his narrative. The story is working something out, like in Traitor, for example. Nesa Kumaran, the protagonist, is the worst kind of human. He betrays his fellow militants. He's an inept terrorist, botches everything up, full of himself. And then he also rapes his daughter. I mean, this is the worst kind of, if you make a list of a human being who is a bad human being who ought to be punished or killed, this is the human being you come up with. And yet in the end, you read the novel and you realize Shobasakthi is saying, everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Your state cannot treat you differently just because you're a bad human being, which is such a lesson to a modern security state, which does all its cruelties in the name of, saving the good citizen. We will pass all these, policies, these laws. We will build an infrastructure to protect the good citizens who have nothing to fear from these this apparatus, because you're a good citizen. We are only identifying and taking out the bad citizens, the terrorists, the ones who propose to do evil towards the world. So it is a horrible system that is then put in place. And all of Shobas books, Shobasakti's books, his short stories, kind of really think about that. They make you think about that, and they make you refuse that first instinct where you say, I don't, he's a bad person, especially with students, right? I mean, when we teach complicated texts, literature in the classroom, you would have, undergraduates and even graduates sometimes who would quickly in their head decide, this person is a good person, this person is a bad person, this person should be saved, and this person's suffering should be taken into consideration. And they would reject suffering by people whom they regard as, not ethically pure, or not good people. This is a cruel person, so his suffering or her suffering, I don't really care about. And Shobasakthi, really, his novels, I mean, if we are to think about what does he give the world, he does really wants us to engage with what is suffering. What is suffering in the modern state? That's what it is. He's an extremely modern writer. He critiques the modern state because the modern state, the shadow of the modern state is, of course, as Adorno says, it's the fascist state, right? So the democratic modern state that we agree is what we should promote also comes with this baggage or this shadow, which is, it can turn fascist very quickly. And he's very, very interested in kind of documenting that, in pointing to us, how does fascism enter your house, your household? And how does it work on your body? How does it work on your soul? So in a lot of ways, he's a post-World War II writer who is, who takes, who kind of gives us in literature what Foucault or Agamben, do in philosophy and theory. So you can actually bring the theory and read the book and say, we can see this worked out here. I find him, therefore, extraordinarily illuminating that way and so important as a global writer.
All right. So I think at this point, I'll kind of recenter the discussion back into reading Shobasakthi and take you to that question. What the introduction of someone like Shobasakthi into Sri Lankan writing, broadly speaking, how does it like pitch into how we read Sri Lanka as a place, Sri Lanka as a space? How does Shobasakthi kind of, unsettle that reading?
Right. He unsettles the nationalist narrative, right, which becomes a problematic narrative at various points in our history. And he's such a historically astute writer. He, like his 2015 novel Box, is set in Batticaloa, the eastern region, and the whole Batticaloa region, all along the eastern coast. And what he does is he talks about a family that is living in a kind of belongs to the Padumar caste. He's also very good with caste. We'll also talk about that. To the Padumar caste, for whom their personal identity is a caste identity rather than an ethnic identity. They don't think of themselves as Tamil, but they think of themselves as Padumar first and foremost. And they then are impacted by the 1954 riots, and then the colonization that was a state-run colonization of Tamil regions where Sinhala farmers were, transplanted because of the Galoya resettlement plan. So he kind of refers to it. It's not like a how do I say, a lecture there, but then the family's memories of the various violences that had taken place each time. A kind of a history had happened to them, even though they live in an extremely remote part, and they are farmers. They are farming in that region. And the Tamil village, the Padumar village, slowly becomes a Sinhala village. And the main character in the novel, whose story we read throughout, her memories of her uncle, her grandparents, etc., they plot it according to the various programs that had taken place in 1977, in 1983, in 85, etc., etc. She is born in the late 1980s, the girl. So when the stories of this girl who is pushed into joining, it is not by choice. It is simply a kind of a cruel set of incidences that take place to her, traumatic beyond belief, that lands her in the tiger camp. So she ends up in the tiger camp. She becomes a tiger warrior when she's like 16. She's a child soldier. And then at 19, they fit her out with the movement fits her out with a bomb to be a suicide bomber. And she refuses at the last minute to carry the bombing through, not because of any kind of, deep kind of moral questioning of, I don't want to kill people, but she did not want to do it because they simply wanted her to kill herself. And she thought that was a petty thing to do. So her refusal to blow herself up is an ethical decision that is a deeply felt ethical decision. Of course, she gets arrested, and the novel is a prison novel, whereas Traitor has sections that are in the prison. This novel is written by this 19-year-old who goes in to the prison and never comes out. She is, she dies in prison, of course. Mm-hmm. So her memories of 2 years of being in secret torture camps and then living and slowly dying in the prison is this Itcha. Itcha is the novel, where she imagines escaping, not by, fighting her way out or digging her way out, which you would imagine how, a prisoner would imagine escaping from a prison, but she imagines escaping through marriage, that somebody would come and marry her and take her out to a diasporic country where she goes and lives and has a child. Whole thing is imagined. And the novel is an extraordinary kind of rumination on patriarchy, because the world that she imagines living in a cold nation, some Scandinavian country, is actually with an abusive husband. And she then, imagines a death for herself there. So it is on the one hand, it's a prison novel, and on the other hand, it is also a refugee novel. So his kind of playing with somebody who cannot ever escape, and the only escape she's capable of imagining is that of a refugee. And if you're female, then there's no escape from patriarchy either. So his description of history, of a nationalism that is deeply problematic, and a simple nationalism that both groups, the majority as well as the minority, swear by, is deeply, complicated in real people's lives. No one actually subscribes to such a simple nationalism, and he questions that, and in a profound way he questions that. Does it make sense?
Makes a lot of sense, and also I think it kind of makes me kind of go down memory lane, where I was actually teaching Shobasakthi a couple of years. The last teaching appointment I had, I remember actually the last year I was teaching, when I knew that I was about to quit my job in a few months. I even experimented by populating the course I was teaching with a few conflict-related narratives. I mean, I'm interested in conflict narratives, but also I was trying to experiment how people would respond to what I would call the multi-directional reading of conflict, how conflict is framed, how it's experienced from simultaneously, different points of the same battlefield, so to speak. I remember during that year I had Shobasakthi, probably Traitor. I had Traitor with the honors class, and I did Gorilla for the general class. And I remember teaching a couple of Southern texts alongside. And also, if you have heard of this one, it's translated into English as a war journey. It's by a former Liberation Tigers soldier called Malaravan, translated by in Malathi. I think she's a New Zealand resident Tamil scholar. Malathi had so this was originally, I think, published in 1992 by the Liberation Tigers publication division. So
Right.
it reads as the diary of a Liberation Tiger soldier who died young. And
Yes.
the English translation is done by Penguin, published somewhere around 2015. And
Wow.
I was like quite surprised to find this quite openly for sale in Sri Lanka.
Right.
And so, because I have read a few memoirs written by uh, Sri Lankan army soldiers, because there was a wave in Sri Lanka soon after the war. People kind of who used to wave the sword, they took the pen after the war. They started
Yeah.
writing memoirs. It was
Right.
like a wave.
Right. Right.
So there was
Right.
one guy who was, I think, quite an elite officer serving in the Eastern Province. He had written a it's a bit like it's almost a fictionalized memoir, an auto-fiction, so to speak. So there were references to a few battles, Mankulam, so on and so forth. And interestingly, the incidents in Malaravan's book, A War Journey, they refer to the same battles, but from the other side. So we see the same kind of metaphors, like references to the brutal enemy, the ruthless enemy. So we have the same kind of what do you call it, the jingoist language, right, being bandied from two sides. So this is something I was interested in, and I kind of tried to share that experience with people I was working with at the time. And I think Shobasakthi was quite a revelation there as well, because what you mentioned earlier is quite right, because the Sri Lankan conflict that is often framed in the mainstream classroom, it comes from a very safe or even privileged position. When you read some of these memories, some of these narratives, even Shyam Selvadurai, it's a fairly privileged text when you kind of juxtapose it with this. So with that, I think I would like to kind of direct you to another very important aspect of the kind of discussion we are having, which is to do with the critique, the global or the Tamil critique, who intervenes with, who negotiates with some of these representations. How do you see the contemporary global Tamil critique? How do you see that intervention in the context of literary appreciation of this kind?
Right. So when you talked about the memoirs, I was struck by something, which is, it's that's such a good segue to actually think about this. There are many of them in Tamil publishing memoirs. They're men in their 50s, 60s who were former soldiers in various movements, some of them more politically savvy than others, who write about, how they entered into a world that couldn't contain them, etc., etc. Very different, actually, from what Shobasakthi does. But the sad thing is, when there are discussions in literary circles in Tamil, I'm talking about in Tamil literary circles, I was, because of Zoom, one is able to participate or, kind of listen in on a lot of these, panels, which is very interesting. They are all kind of placed on a level. So you would have a former lieutenant who is now like 64 years old with, one of the Tamil movements who would write who's living in France or someplace, and or Switzerland, who's written his memoir in Tamil. That person's book would be discussed alongside Shobasakthi's Icha. There is absolutely no way you can compare one to another, but it is a pity that because he publishes in Tamil, that's the only reason. And he's writing about the war. They all are read as novels or books about the war. when I find, this is, would you talk about, kind of 19th century Russian texts that deal with the war as, okay, this is a war novel. So it is a pity that they are, that the framework of understanding these texts is deeply problematic in a lot of ways. And they're problematic because on the one hand, people who are able to read in Tamil, who will be, let me put it this way. If one is living and is Indian in Tamil Nadu and is a critic in Tamil Nadu, their understanding of Shobasakthi and what Shobasakthi is writing about is in a lot of ways handicapped. And that is true of reading Cheran also, because he writes about the IPKF in brutally unforgiving terms. And for a lot of Indian readers, that is difficult to accept. They would, have meetings where you would have really sophisticated, Tamil writers who are leftist progressives in every way you admire them, who would then fall on the floor and roll around and insist, oh, that is not true. And then, of course, for a lot of Indian Tamil critics, the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi is unpalatable. They can move beyond that. So the readership itself then becomes really split. It's incommensurable in a lot of ways, even though he's publishing in India. I remember he gave me this anecdote, which was kind of interesting and so revelatory. When his translation of the Gorilla came out in 2008, right? So he comes in 2008 or 2000, I think it came out in 2007. In 2008, this was a year before the war. The war ended in 2009. He was in Chennai, where the German study group, some foundation, a large foundation, invited him to come and read a selection from the Tamil Gorilla, because they had all read the English translation and they wanted him to read a selection. When he arrived, he realized that the section that they wanted him to read was the place where Rocky Raj, who has gone to Germany or someplace, says the Germans are better. That was the selection they wanted him to read. It is so absurd. It is Kafkaesque in a lot of ways, how people read him who have very little understanding about politics, about how to engage with a text of this kind. He thought it was very funny. He has an extraordinary Sri Lankan sense of humor. So he told this story everywhere. They want to read, this was the section they wanted to read because it reflected back well on their nation. So they were not interested in reading about a boy who is mad, right? I mean, it is in a lot of ways a failure, I think, of the critic to frame these stories well. So it's one thing to translate. Your question about, how does a global critic deal with this? It is a huge, I think, a work that hasn't been done, that people, I think, Sri Lankan born or Sri Lankan understanding critics to be able to provide kind of frameworks, how to read these texts, because he also does not in any way, even in his Itcha, which constantly surprises me, he knows he has to write the novel and I will translate it, but he never compromises anywhere in thinking about, would a translator be able to translate this? He never cares. He's so honest to his writings. He would be as arcane and as archaic as he wants to be with his names, for example. Those of us who live in the West, one of the things that we struggle with is our names that are, polysyllabic names. And he, that's something that he does with his characters, gives them polysyllabic names that make it very difficult to kind of easily, in a cosmopolitan way, talk about his characters. He does not care in that way. So the job of the global critic then becomes to kind of give interpretive frameworks to understand, to point out, this is the history, this is what he's writing about, rather than just a story that could be excerpted into a global literature class, which is also problematic, right? I mean, for you, Vihanga, to teach in Sri Lanka is very different, the novel as a conflict novel. And let's say somebody picking this book up in, a Western nation as part of literature from the so-called third world, or, literature. So you have a South American novel, you have, a Sri Lankan novel, you have an Indian novel, a Dalit novel, and then, everyone reads it as, global literature and is pleased with it. So there's no kind of intimacy with the stories, with the characters who are being presented in the novel. Does it make sense?
Pretty much. So I think at the risk of running longer than a Shobasakthi novel, I think we should bring this conversation to a close. But I think not without having a few ideas, a few, I would say, sneak peeks at what is coming up in your own career as a translator, what projects lie ahead of you, maybe in a kind of a short way. Yeah.
Right. So I have two of his novels, the 2015 Box, which is of a, really talks about the end of the war, what happened. It's set in like 2011 in a Dalit village, which is also, the novel really talks about how, caste functions within the Tamil culture. The tragedy of the Dalit village is, on the one hand, the larger security forces and the war, the depredations that take place, in their lives. And then at a very different level, their caste also makes them, victims in a way that, that makes it very difficult for any of them to survive, not just the war, but the aftermath of the war. So that's Box. And Icha, which is the 2019 novel that I talked about. Both have been translated. I have written, extended afterwards for both of them, which is something that I see as my job, which is, exactly what I was talking about. How, as a global critic, do we place these novels within in a kind of a very intimate way? I think that's the word I would use. The intimate way, in the sense, this is the culture, this is the literature. You read it against these other texts and words, not as a broad, or like I said, oh, here is a Sri Lankan text that has an interesting story. So, and my other project is, I have finished translating the Sri Lankan born exilic poet Cheran's poetry. I and a colleague who lives in Canada, Geeta Sukumaran, we have both translated a whole selection of his poems that had not been translated before. Cheran has been translated by multiple people, everyone from Lakshmi Holmstrom. They have translated him, but so we chose poems that have not been translated before. Two of his latest collections that came out in 2019, we took all the poems from that and translated them, and then of course also wrote an introduction and an afterword. So that project, Cheran imagines it to be, having a Sinhala translation also with it. So that is taking some time to be published. So those are the three projects. My project that I am right now translating is, interestingly, not Sri Lankan, but this is a Dalit writer who, her name is Alahiya Nayahi Ammal. She died somewhere in the 1990s, but this is set in the 1930s and 40s, when she came of age in southern India, deep southern India, where, on the one hand, you had the British, who were kind of a presence in their lives, because she talks about the kacheri, or the legal system. Her father worked within it. And then she coming of age in a deeply patriarchal, caste-ridden culture. She writes this in the 1970s, 77, she writes this, and it was published in 1998, the Tamil version. It is used in folklore departments as a kind of a informational text, but it is a extraordinary literary endeavor by somebody who is able to, just like Shobha, rewrite a narrative in terms that will illuminate a kind of a uncomplicated caste or national discourse and complicate it in profound ways. So that's the one that I'm translating. It's a dialectic. She writes in dialect. So for a translator, this is extremely difficult. Shobasakthi too, completely dialectical. So his characters speak distinct dialect Tamil. So for a translator, that is an impossible problem. That's not a problem that can be solved. So this particular project that I'm working on, Kavali, also does dialect. So it is a puzzle that I'm working with. So I don't know when I will finish it, because one teaches and one translates, and the teaching takes over very often. So, in the nooks and corners of one's life, whatever time you can get, you translate. But then with COVID and Zoom classes, those nooks and corners have gone away. So this is the truth of the COVID experience, is one has no nooks and corners that one can say, oh, I'm home from the university, I can do this. One is never home from the university.
Yeah, seems like your plate is full, but let's, hope for the best and see some of these work out. And looking futuristically, let's hope at some point some of Shobasakti's work will be also available in Sinhala, because that might be a very different reading experience for the majority of readers in Sri Lanka.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. One hopes.
Yeah. Thank you, Anushiya, for joining this conversation. It was actually quite nice to have you. We've been planning this for a while, and hopefully people who might follow this up might have something to take home when they go for a bookshop to look for a Shobasakthi text next time. Thank you so much.
Vihanga, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for speaking with me, helping me think through a lot of things that I thought I knew for sure, but then when one needs to articulate it in this way, it helps. It really helps. Thank you so much.